Hello, everyone. I'll be sharing some thoughts on pleasure in the context of music and how its role has changed over time through the lens of Gregorian chant. First, we have to define pleasure. According to the dictionary, pleasure is a feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. This definition isn't all that helpful. Maybe looking at some real-world examples will bring some clarity. An obvious example is taking a bite of a rich chocolate cake fresh out of the oven. Its flavor overwhelms your taste buds and gives you that rush of sugar, transporting you to another dimension. A more extreme example is pleasure unnaturally induced by narcotics. Surprisingly, the way these substances interact with the human body is pretty similar to sugar and directly activate the pleasure centers in the brain. Both these examples are very physical, dealing with the body's sensory perception. What about a less physical and more emotional example of pleasure? One example is every time we meet someone new and say, "It's a pleasure to meet you." Sometimes we don't mean it and it means nothing, but when we do mean it, something about this human we're meeting for the first time piques our interest. Perhaps a short conversation reveals common goals and passions, filling us with the pleasure that comes with the establishment of a new human connection. So, pleasure can definitely have physical or more emotional sources, but if the latter is true, what differentiates pleasure from happiness? Well, one possible explanation is that happiness describes a usually lasting state of mind, while pleasure describes a fleeting physical sensation, specifically the release of dopamine. Music is unique in its ability to directly elicit emotional and physical responses in us. Little else on this planet can make someone instantly sad or happy, drift into a sweet slumber, or get up and dance. Separating out all the phenomena that make up a musical experience is difficult, or even impossible. We like some music because it makes us feel a certain way, or we think it's beautiful, or we like the energy it creates, or any number of other reasons. But somewhere in there, on a more superficial level, pleasure absolutely plays a role. Part of our attraction to particular musical works is that dopamine hit. The auditory information we receive is interpreted as music by the brain, in addition to other chemical responses associated with the musical experience. Dopamine is released when a musical expectation or prediction is fulfilled. It's no surprise, then, that some of the most popular chart toppers are catchy, in a way making them easy to accurately predict in the mind of the listener, maximizing the potential for dopamine hits. While it hasn't always been looked at from a chemical or scientific perspective, the general idea that some form of pleasure derived from music might be a more superficial sensation on the same level perhaps as otherworldly pleasures is not a new one. In fact, people were thinking along these lines all the way back in the medieval era. The perception of pleasure in music and how it has or has not changed over time is quite interesting, and I'd like to examine it further by looking at sources from two contrasting eras, the medieval and the 21st century. In the medieval era, life was hard and life was short. For the most part, it was lights out at 35 years of age. In medieval England, the common person lived in a house without a floor and slept on ground covered in sewage. The desire to have children and start a family had to be weighed against the 1 in 5 odds of the mother dying in childbirth. It's no wonder, then, that people longed for a reality beyond their own existence. For this, many in Europe turned to the Christian Church. The Church's presence in medieval society was most certainly not always a positive one, but it did create some of the most stunningly beautiful elements of medieval society in the form of captivating cathedrals and moving music, which have quite literally stood the test of time. That music is partially the Gregorian chant. It was music intended for Christian religious observances, rooted in the codified liturgy and music of Roman leaders that spread all throughout Europe. In this era, chants were performed with the specific purpose of communicating church doctrine. Any effects beyond this communication, like pleasure or enjoyment, were embraced by some, but condemned as sinful by others. St. Augustine wrote about his inner conflict with the perils of musical pleasure in his Confessions. When it happens that I am moved more by the song than what is sung, I confess sinning grievously, and I would prefer not to hear the singer at such times. See now my condition. In contrast, St. Basil's account from the same 4th century period expresses no such reservations about the pleasures of music. He blended the delight of melody with doctrine, in order that through the pleasantness and softness of the sound we might unawares receive what was useful in the words. With these contrasting viewpoints, we're left unsure which account truly reflects the position of the Church at the time. Of more interest, perhaps, are the thoughts of the commoners and how music perhaps lightened their lives. Unfortunately, no such accounts appear to exist or have been preserved. On the surface, the present day might as well be on a different planet than the medieval era, a planet with less suffering and seeming abundance, even if present events might obscure this progress. The persistence of the Christian Church and the Gregorian chant through all this change make them an interesting lens to view musical pleasure. In the present, the Vatican's official policies on the chanting of the Gregorian chant indicate its understanding of the utility of musical pleasure as a tool for building associations between the chant and elements of church doctrine. Pope Pius specifically instructs congregants to take part in Gregorian chants so they may be filled with a deep sense of the beauty of the liturgy in order to bring them closer to the worship, much like St. Basil did so many centuries ago. Priest and editor of the journal Sacred Music discusses this idea in more detail, describing how the associations formed between the chant and practices of worship prompt an inwards focus whenever the beauty of the chant is felt. Just like in our earlier discussion of medieval times, the perspectives of those who aren't church officials or prominent members of society are sorely missing. Nowhere is the first-hand accounts of audience members or normal members of society. That would be a great way to expand the study in the future. Now, a little bit on research challenges and strategies. So for my chosen topic, finding information on a specific part of something pretty vague was a challenge. I kind of ran out of the sort of go-to historical sources and ended up delving into multidisciplinary sources, science journals, and so on. And that was an unexpected result of the whole research project that I got new perspectives and connected seemingly disconnected things, and they all worked together and prompted new ideas and understanding of what the musical experience is and how it can and can't be broken down into sort of objective science, and the ways that sometimes it has to stay as a little fuzzier, more abstract a set of emotions or experiences. And the internet's a really big place, and I realized make sure I'm not making my life any harder than it is, and to take advantage of all the resources that sort of sort through all the search results for you. So specifically, when looking at more scientific journals, which is what I was a little more used to, instead of just doing a blanket search, casting that wide net on Google Scholar or something like that, find specific databases targeted for the topic. And that means the database is already sorted through all the documents that are relevant to my general area of study. And so instead of having 7,000 search results, maybe you only have 700. And then a variety of other resources that are useful, like review papers, white papers, and of course textbooks that have already compiled resources for you. And you can just look at the references list and bam, no searching required. And of course, on the historical side of things like theses and journals that were relevant to my topic were also quite useful. Thank you for listening. Any questions?